Yeah, I suppose just by way of introduction, as you all know by now, the Democracy Centre, with the support of IPS, has been really focused on trying to document what has happened in the campaign, with a view to seeing what lessons can be learned from the anti-mining struggle on the ground in El Salvador and from the international campaign that supported that struggle. So we've been doing that in two ways. The first way has been to do a series of in-depth interviews with people who are deeply involved in the campaign. And we've been publishing, we've published two long version articles based on those interviews. And this is the second thing that we're doing. So together with IPS, hosting these video conferences. So this is the first of two video conferences. This one is really focused on the international solidarity effort to support the anti-mining struggle in El Salvador. It's in English for that reason. It's really with that focus on the international effort and with that audience in mind. And the second video conference we're going to have later this week or early next week. And that will be much more focused on the struggle on the ground in El Salvador with people based there. So that will be obviously in Spanish. And then we will be publishing both the articles and the recordings of the video conferences to support this effort to document and share the lessons from what has happened there. So I suppose for people who are viewing the video after the recording, and to put this all into context, and as you guys already know, on the 29th of March, the national legislature in El Salvador voted to ban all metal mining in the country. It was the first country in the world to do so. And that was just a few months after ICSID, the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes at the World Bank, ruled unanimously against the gold mining corporation that was bringing a legal case against El Salvador. So this, in this combination of victories, international solidarity played a really important role. So I just wanted to start by asking each of you, in a few sentences, in a minute or two, just to give your name and the name of your organization and the role that the organization played in the international solidarity campaign. And one thing that you were involved in that you feel was had most impact on the campaign. So three things: your name, the name of your organization, and one thing that you were involved in the campaign that you feel had most impact. So maybe we could begin with Jen.
I was hoping you wouldn't say that. Well, my name's Jen Moore. I'm the Latin America Program Coordinator at Mining Watch Canada. And we played somewhat of a coordinating role in Canada with Canadian organizations that form part of the International Allies Coalition that's made up of organizations from many other parts of the world, and provide input and research and ideas on the strategies and the actions that the coalitions carried out. What have we been part of that's had most impact? Good question. Well, I mean, I guess most recently, and I do think that, you know, it was sort of a small role that we played, but helping to broker a relationship with the governor of Nueva Vizcaya in the Philippines, just who was able to be in El Salvador. It was strangely well-timed, just on the eve of the vote on the mining ban. And I think we weren't the only group involved in that. We had a role to play, as others were actually more involved in coordinating his trip and making that really happen. But having those relationships and being able to ensure that he was on the ground and that word was getting out about his role and the testimonies that he was able to provide to Salvadoran legislatures on the eve of their vote on that mining ban, I think ended up being timely to debunk the responsible mining discourse that OceanaGold was using in kind of the end game around the mining ban at the end of March.
Thank you, Jen. Robin?
So I'm Robin Broad. I'm a professor of international development in a multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary way at American University in Washington, D.C. But my organization is not involved with this. I am involved as an independent academic. I am connected to I'm on the board of Earthworks and focused on the Global South. So both of those organizations are involved in this mining work and this global trade work. But again, I'm involved as an individual, and really as am I the only activist scholar, or we have a couple maybe activist scholars who are individuals in this, but I'm not on the key core of International Allies. That's officially, I believe, Jen and Manuel. It's very funny to talk about these things because when we do International Allies work, I don't think we think of ourselves that way. Like, are we in the core? Are we in the second tier or whatever? But I am an active participant. I think, like Jen, it's a little hard for me to answer your question about what have I been involved with that's had the most impact. And I think that's one of the key things to note about this in terms of success, that everything is linked to everything else. And to the extent things worked, it wasn't one or two people who did one thing, but it was almost like the stars were aligned. So more than one of us got involved. So to the extent I had the most impact, I would guess my main role in some sense as an academic was to fact check everything, to make sure that every flyer, every press release we sent out was factually correct, and to write some of the longer articles to document this case. And then as Jen just talked about the visit of the governor of Nueva Vizcaya, Carlos Padilla, and his chief engineer, EDSA, to El Salvador. I've lived in the Philippines for a number of years. So that again was serendipity, that I had this connection to the Philippines, where when I started working on El Salvador, there were no links between the Philippines and El Salvador except the shared colonial legacy. But so when we planned this, we didn't plan that I would go to El Salvador with him, but I ended up going. On other things there were a number of things that had impact because 3 or 4 of us were excited about doing them. But it's hard, the impact was a series of things, and it wasn't that one thing itself had the most impact, but that when you link them together. So
okay.
Telling the truth of OceanaGold when it was telling lies.
Okay.
Getting the governor there, I'm finishing, getting the governor there at just the right moment in time. It could have been the wrong moment in time, but it just kind of worked out.
Great, thank you, Robin. Thank you, Robin. Pedro?
My name is Pedro Cabezas. I work for an organization based in Canada called Salvador, but I work for that organization, but I'm actually based in El Salvador. And in El Salvador, I work for our partner organization, which is Cryptis. In terms of my role and maybe the contributions, I think a bit privileged in that I have seen the movement from a whole bunch of different perspectives. I started getting involved in the anti-mining movement while I was living in Canada back in 2007. And when there was talk about Pacific Rim, a Canadian-based company that was generating problems in El Salvador, I got involved with a number of Salvadoran Canadians And we formed this group called Canadians Against Mining in El Salvador, and the idea was to support the anti-mining movement, La Mesa Nacional Frente a la Minería, the National Roundtable Against Mining in El Salvador, and to try to make the linkages between the Canadian organizations and Salvadoran organizations in Canada and communities being affected by mining in El Salvador. Later on, I had the opportunity to come to El Salvador and work as a coordinator for the International Allies Against Mining for a couple of years. And as a coordinator of the International Allies, my role was to be the mediator between the communications between La Mesa in El Salvador and the International Allies, and to pass communications back and forth, and to publicize a lot of the news that were coming out of El Salvador to the international audience, and to be a liaison between the two movements, and just try to bring it all together. And the later part of my work has been working with cryptids in El Salvador, particularly leading or coordinating the work around the Territories Free of Mining campaign. It's a campaign that was started by Cryptids, which is a territorially based organization to hold consultations on mining on towns that were affected by mining projects in the country. And through that, we had I think that the best impact that my organization and the work that we've had over the last phase of the campaign was to push for that involvement of local communities and local governments and institutions that are locally based to take a position on the issue of mining, to get communities involved in making a choice of whether they wanted to have mining projects in their community or not. And through that, pushing the national movement and both the national authorities and government to actually have the issue in the public agenda, and at the same time show at the international level, to the international community, that the communities that were affected by mining in El Salvador did not have did not want mining projects at the local level in their territories. So I think that's perhaps the largest contribution and the greatest contribution that I have made to the movement, is to be that liaison between what's happening in El Salvador and what is happening at the international level.
Thank you, Pedro. Manuel?
And people that work in my institute, including our director and others, we were,
Manuel.
Yeah, sorry. My name is Manuel Perez Rocha. I'm an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, better known as IPS. And I have worked at IPS almost 10 years, of which 9 years have been working on this work on El Salvador. And I think IPS, and together with my colleagues at IPS, we've been very, I think, key in bringing to a very high level of power to make very visible the local demands of people in Cabañas, to make them visible at the level of the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, at the World Bank. Even the director, the president himself of the World Bank, has heard about the local demands of the people in Cabañas. So our role has been that, to be kind of the transmitter of what people in El Salvador have been demanding, and what we believe is the culprit of power, which is these institutions that have been promoting these free trade agreements and these suits, like the suit that El Salvador was under. So we, among other things, among the more global work that we coordinated with Mining Watch, here in Washington, for example, we brought together hundreds of organizations to protest, to do the leafleting sessions, as we call them. And we also work together with Salvadoran people, Salvadoran migrants here in Washington, to make visible and to raise the voice of the people of El Salvador here in Washington, where the World Bank and the ICSID are obviously located. So I think our role, magnifying this voice internationally, but concretely in Washington, was, in my opinion, key. One key factor of the success of this story. No?
Thanks, Manuel. So I just wanted to continue by asking just this question about international solidarity and the role international solidarity should play in these struggles. And this is something that came up in the interviews that we did. So here's a statement for you to react to. That the role of international solidarity is to counter the lies and the falsehoods of the corporation in the international debates on the one hand, and on the other hand, to make connections, to facilitate connections of different kinds. So I just wanted to ask you if you could react to that and how that resonates or not with your experience of the international solidarity work in this campaign. And I'd like to begin with you, Pedro, if that's okay.
Sure. I think what you described before in terms of like the role of international solidarity being able to counter the lies that are spread is one important role of international solidarity, but it's not the only role. But I think it's really key, and in this case, it has been really important to have all these international organizations generating a narrative of a struggle in El Salvador, and a narrative that reflects the desires of the communities to live in a sustainable environment, to live without the contamination of mining companies, and to determine their own form of development, not the form of development that is normally pushed by mining corporations and governments and international financial institutions. So definitely there is a lot to say, and a lot that can be learned from this campaign and this movement to ban mining in El Salvador, because as Robin has mentioned, we had many academics that were generating a lot of a counter narrative to the narrative of the corporations. And she was very involved in that. Organizations like Mining Watch, IPS, and other organizations like contributed all to generate this narrative, and that's important. I think also the role of international solidarity is to be allies, as our own organization says, with the international allies against mining in El Salvador, is to work together with the communities that are affected by mining as allies. They have to say, and to magnify their voices, and not to be the voice it's per se, but to magnify it, to be the conduit to the voice. And one important thing that Manuel also mentioned in terms of IPS being able to reach all these high levels of and positions of power, like people in the World Bank, the CEOs of the companies. The international solidarity can help us redefine the power relationships that exist between the CEO that is sitting in their desk in a tower in a first world city, and the people in the communities that are farmers, that are cattle ranchers, that are being affected by mining. There is normally there is a power relationship there that where the decisions are taken at the tower of the corporations, and the impacts are felt by communities. And the international solidarity can help bridge that gap. Bring the voice of these communities to this CEO, and to show them the indignity that communities have to suffer while their projects are being executed at the local level. And that, there is some power in having somebody from a community, for instance, being in the sidewalk of Toronto, at the Toronto Stock Exchange, denouncing what the corporation is doing. And that only is possible through the work that international solidarity does.
Thank you, Pedro. Robin, would you like to react to that? And maybe this point in particular about international organizations being, the importance of international organizations giving prominence to the voices of local communities and the challenges around that. So maybe like the original question and that issue, if that's okay.
Okay, so I actually am not sure I'm comfortable with calling what we're doing international solidarity. I think that if you ask the question, how did I get involved and how did we each get involved, one of the key things is that, and I won't go into that answer as much, but a key thing and a key impact thing that I think we all stressed, but maybe didn't stress it enough, or at least I didn't, is the formation of international allies. this idea that you have a coalition of global groups, some of whom are development groups, some of whom are human rights groups, some of whom are experts on mining, some of whom care about water, some of whom are academics with a little bit or a lot of knowledge on different things, some of whom are groups like CISPAS that would consider itself an international solidarity group. But I think part of what was so exciting about International Allies as a coalition and other coalitions too, is that we didn't simply, yes, we did it to be transmission belts for the voices of people on the ground in El Salvador, but really the struggle was on 3 levels. It's a local level in El Salvador, it's a national level in El Salvador, and then it's a global level. And so we were also doing it not just to be in solidarity with people in El Salvador, but because it's our problem too. The corporations are headquartered in the US, in Canada, in Australia. The World Bank and the arbitration venues are here. So I think part of why this worked is because that transmission belt went both ways. That it wasn't simply, and again, different organizations that were part of Allies might define themselves differently. And Pedro probably has memorized the description of International Allies as its mission statement, but I don't think, at least for me, that I would see this work. It was a new kind of accompaniment on the ground, research accompaniment in terms of protests in Canada, in El Salvador, in Australia, which we didn't bring in, but we have to talk about the importance of having people there in Australia, since this is an Australian-Canadian corporation, protests in El Salvador. And we were doing it to link this up globally, nationally, and locally.
Robin, what for you are the main differences between solidarity work as traditionally understood and this kind of accompaniment or research accompaniment that you described?
No, I want to be really careful here, because I'm not saying anything bad about international solidarity. International solidarity is a really important thing, and it's very necessary, and groups that define themselves as doing international solidarity are among my heroes. But I think part of the difference is defining this not as simply El Salvador's problem, but as also a problem that transcends borders, goes into other countries, and where the change has to come outside of El Salvador as well as in El Salvador.
Great, thank you, Robin. So just moving on, it's a related question, and it came up in the interviews. I think it might actually have been you, Manuel, and we spoke about there being 2 types of solidarity, and one type of solidarity that is kind of vertical, maybe in its in how it functions, and it's quite often in the context of a relationship between a funder and a grantee. So that kind of conventional development type model. And then a second type of solidarity that's not so much based on money, but based on there being an overarching struggle and there being kind of common but different objectives within that, which is touching on what Robin is describing. So Manuel, I wonder if you'd speak a little bit about how that played out in your experience of this campaign.
And in my first intervention, I just said that we were conveyors here in the centers of power of the people of El Salvador, but this is just one angle of seeing our relation with the Salvadoran people in this struggle. I think definitely this work with the Salvadorans has been 2 ways. It hasn't been the traditional one-way solidarity in which normally the northern NGO helps the partner in the south. And I'm not going to give more, I don't think we need to go very much into detail about this, but this has been the traditional pattern of international cooperation, no? Which has a more north to south vision. And in this struggle, it wasn't at all about that. It was very much about learning from the Salvadorans. And when we brought their voice to Washington, it wasn't only to magnify it to in front of power, in front of the World Bank, in front of ICSID, but also with the organizations here in Washington and the United States, and definitely around the world that are fighting also corporate power. So what the Salvadorans gave us was, with all this struggle against mining, was a concrete narrative, and a concrete narrative that helped us visualize how to, for example, how to combat the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has already failed. And we have very strong protests here in Washington in front of the World Bank because of the case against El Salvador, but which were protests also against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, the TPP agreement that would have extended NAFTA, expanded NAFTA in so many other countries of the world. So this is just an example of how we took from the Salvadorans free trade is bad for water, for example, no? And this was a very concrete thing that we've been fighting in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the defense of the public, of what is public and what are not natural resources that have to be defended from privatization. And the courage of the local communities and the people of El Salvador have been an example worldwide of how to combat these agreements and why. Because again, the narrative has been so clear, so concrete, that we have learned a lot about El Salvador. So this has been a two-way solidarity movement, which I think it's an example. I think it might be the most valuable thing that me personally, I have taken from this experience.
I think what you're starting to talk about, Manuel, is this. So what came up for us as we were speaking to the people most involved was that this was a really great example of how a local struggle can be connected to these global campaigns on related issues in ways that strengthen both. So like that's something else. I think you actually mentioned this also in the interview we did with you, that creating a common understanding of how local struggles and international campaigns on related issues complement each other was a really central kind of strategic, a really important building block, let's say, in the campaign, both at local level and internationally. So I suppose my question is about what we've learned about connecting local struggles to international campaigns on related issues. And Jen, would you like to come in on that?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that International Allies has done well, and that's really fundamental to this sort of work, is sustaining long-term relationships, having a long-term vision that I do think is centered, or at least guided very strongly by the core demands from our partners in the Global South. And then can be linked in these different sort of sites of struggle where we all find ourselves depending on where we're situated, whether it's, Mining Watch Canada that's fighting this unjust model of mining from, Canada, kind of the belly of the beast for the globalized industry, or an organization like IPS that's in Washington, where you've got the World Bank and ICSID, and so the company, takes the struggle out, wrenches it out of the locality of the community, which is really where the potential impacts of any mine would be felt, and where the real impacts of the kind of social division and violence that were generated by a project have been felt. But that is nonetheless, there is a battle that's also fought in that that area. And so all the work around, debunking the lies and legitimizing and lifting up the voices of the local struggle is really crucial and important, because that's another site of struggle that's relevant and crucial and linked to what's going on at the local level. And so I think, the other piece, and I think what Robin was talking about, just the makeup of international allies, is quite a complex grouping of organizations that define themselves differently, include researchers, independent researchers, and a whole range of organizations, is also reflective of the complexity of the problem and the fact that the problem also evolves. And so having a long-term relationship with communities on the ground that is there, where there's a strong give and take, a discussion about local objectives, how they'll fit with the national and international work, but that can change over time, also means that you can evolve with it. And so that you can have, reach out to engineers, sociologists, anthropologists that can come in at key times, or people that have relationships in Australia, because now the company's no longer Canadian, it's now Canadian-Australian, and now it has operations too in the Philippines. So all of these things become relevant at different points in time and allow you to adjust and allow you to have these moments of synchronicity. I mean, my comment off the top about where we'd been relevant was quite a, sort of a very small moment in a long struggle that has been driven. And I do think that we can't underestimate the importance and the bravery and how much ultimately it is the local communities that are putting everything on the line in these struggles. And that's why these things do have to be centered and oriented from where their demands and are focused, and that should be the guiding direction, I think, for what we do. And I do think that the Allies did a good job of always keeping in mind the principal goals from El Salvador, and then linking them to the different ways that we can each contribute in common cause with their struggle, but also in these other sort of corresponding struggles that we're part of. I do think that that was something we did well. And just to understand that, it wasn't just kicking out Pacific Rim or Oceana Gold. It was, ultimately getting the ban on metal mining countrywide and keeping that at the forefront, even when the fight became a little bit more oriented towards, shutting down the case at ICSID. So there was an important sort of navigation of demands with a centering. I think that was, that had to be first and foremost local, but then also global, because of the complexity of the industry, but because of the complexity of globalization, because of the complexity of decisions taking place in different forums that communities and local actors simply don't have direct access to, and which with allies you can, and with allies who themselves find them in struggle against different components of the same model.
Thank you, Jen. Pedro, this is like touching on this issue of coordination that you played quite an important role in. So like Jen spoke about the challenge of maintaining relationships over a long term with affected communities in order to be orient from the struggle on the ground. I'm just wondering, in your experience in that coordination role, and we don't have to just talk about the things that went well, we can talk about the difficulties and the challenges. So, just reflecting on your role, the role that you had in what was obviously a very complicated, dynamic of coordinating between such a diversity of actors on both ends. So some of the challenges that came up or lessons that were learned from that coordination role?
It's the whole process is a challenge because we talked a lot about everybody coming together on the one specific demand, on the one specific objective, which is the mining ban in El Salvador and all the ramifications there is to it. But there is, as has been said before, there is many different actors that come together with many different agendas, many different histories of a struggle, many definitions of what is to be in solidarity with people in the global south, or vice versa. People in the global south is what is it to be in a alliance with people in the global north. And for me, the 2 years that I was coordinating the international allies against mining was a challenge because if you are familiar with politics in El Salvador, they have a long history that still reflects, particularly a history that goes back to the recent history goes back to the Civil War, And there were some divisions within the different movements, and those divisions still reflect in the politics locally, unfortunately. But all of this came out to play in the dynamics of the National Roundtable Against Mining. And again, like the international level, you know, I was told that there are different organizations with different agendas that all came together under one specific goal. And it's, when you're in the middle of it, it's hard not to see or not to identify that different agendas play out in the actors, right? And then you add that the personalities of the people that come into these dynamics also adds to the level of complexity, because different people have different personalities, and me being in the middle of all of it was a little complicated. Sorry. The learning part for me was that it is possible to actually bring together such a diverse group of people, a group of organizations with different agendas and different ideas. It is possible to work together, and you know, it requires a lot of patience and a lot of compromise from all the different actors, and we were able to do that, right? We were able to pull together this movement. We were able to coordinate both at the local, at the national, and the international level, and we have achieved a very important victory, and I think it's a model that could be replicated in different parts of the world where the same things are happening. No?
Thank you, Pedro. Robin?
This is a really important thing to be clear about, and to be clear about that with La Mesa and with international allies, different structures and different things happened organically. So we didn't come into this with a model that we were going to plop down because it had worked elsewhere. So La Mesa goes back to La Mesa, the much tighter coalition in El Salvador, tighter in terms of having shared goals that come out of hours, if not weeks and months of discussion. La Mesa has its own dynamic, and the only person on in this interview who's involved in that now is Pedro, because he's actually living in El Salvador. But the rest of us in International Allies, and Pedro when he was liaison for International Allies, we didn't pretend to be we didn't get involved with domestic decisions in El Salvador. And La Mesa started before International Allies. International Allies we started meeting in 2010, 2011, but we didn't hire our first liaison in El Salvador. So there was someone who did this for a year or two before Pedro, Jan Morel, until maybe 2011 or 2012. But as a coalition, International Allies is what we call a loose coalition. So what we say is we take our guidance from La Mesa, but we don't say you have to agree to point 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or 6. You have to agree to the overall goal of La Mesa's goal of banning mining in El Salvador. But the reason I go through this is because it's really easy, as I'm listening to us and imagining someone listening to us, it's really easy to think, oh, this is easy. You just set up a domestic coalition, you set up an international coalition, you hire someone like Pedro to be the liaison between both of them, and it just works. It's really, really tricky stuff. To me, the amazing thing is not that coalitions fall apart. The amazing thing is that coalitions stay together. And in this case, we had a domestic coalition, La Mesa, that stayed together, and we had an international coalition in a number of countries, although with the key bases in the US and Canada and Australia, that stayed together. And we had communication, and I think this is really important. I think it was about, like, in certain periods, as often as once every 2 months, someone from International Allies would go to El Salvador. So we didn't, well, the liaison, Pedro, for example, was really, really important for keeping that communication going with La Mesa, because we realized when we were setting this up that it's impossible to take people like those who are members of La Mesa who are already totally overworked and say to them, okay, in addition, you're going to communicate with us because we've decided that that's what you want to do. So it was really important to have someone on the ground in El Salvador who could not just add to La Mesa's work, but could do some of the communication and more than that. But we also, a lot of why this worked, I think, was at the core of International Allies were people like us who really, really, from the start, cared deeply about what happened in El Salvador. I myself came into this work in 2009 after the 4 people were assassinated on the ground in El Salvador. Some other of you may have come in earlier, but we had those personal links. So when we went to Northern El Salvador and we stayed in Cabañas, we weren't simply building an overall coalition link where if people got tired of some idiosyncrasies or some miscommunication that they would drop that. But we had these very personal, very political, and very professional relationships, as well as among ourselves and international allies, even though there are some people who've been on the phone and international allies phone calls every month for years who I have never met in person.
So the question, Manuel, is like Robin's point is, from as far as I understand it, that it's not a model. You know, you have to respect the kind of organic, unpredictable political dynamics in El Salvador. But what about that process? What have you learned in your experience from that?
Well, I've learned that, I mean, El Salvador is a complex country politically, and many of the people that worked in La Mesa, that are members of La Mesa, many of the organizations have some differences that come from the past, even from the time of the war. And despite of that, they had a very clear objective, that they would come together to fight for the water of the country. So this was a very, very strong common denominator for organizations that are very varied, even within the locality of Cabañas. And despite of differences that they might have had, all along, they always get them for themselves within their networking. When it was time to come out to the press, to do press work or to do a demonstration, what you saw was unity, because the message was very clear. We're here to defend our water from destructive mining companies. And they wouldn't be beating about the bush with all, is that expression, with other issues. They might have troubles with other issues, with other political momentums and with other themes. But when it came to this particular struggle, they left them behind, and they always shown unity towards the public. And this is one way also that the campaign gained the support of the public in El Salvador. It was very clear that the divisions weren't shown. They were very, very, I would say, professional in that sense of knowing how to work this out and gain the support of the general population of El Salvador. So this was one lesson, and we also, I think, we applied it internationally, because we worked with dozens of organizations literally, and we never tried to form a structure in which we would be pointing the finger at anyone for doing something or not doing something. I think we were always very respectful of what any person could give to the international allies and when they could give it. This was somehow a very voluntary work. It wasn't because we are mandated by our institutions to do this work. I think it's very much a heartfelt work that we've been doing. And every person in this screen and every person in the international allies have given what they can give in a very voluntary way. So this has been it's not to say that we haven't had troubles or we haven't had discussions. We've had them and strong ones. But also in the end, what prevails is the will to carry out this work. And I think what we've learned is to have flexibility. I think very formal structures tend to create confrontation. No, so we've formed a very nice, flexible way to work and operate. And I think this was also a lesson from El Salvador, that people are there because they want to, not because they have to. I mean, people are in this struggle because you want to.
Great, thank you, Manuel. So my second last question is about the coverage that the El Salvador struggle achieved internationally. So the campaign, the struggle in El Salvador and the campaign around it really achieved a level of coverage in the international press that had a really important impact, I think, on the outcome. So, and I think it became emblematic of a lot of the similar struggles in other places. So maybe Jen, if you want to come in on this question, it's about, so how do you think that was achieved in your, like, taking a step back and thinking on your own experience? How was this struggle made to be such an emblematic one for similar struggles around the world?
I think there's a number of different things that play into just the level of attention that was brought to the struggle in El Salvador. I think at its heart, I do think that the presence of organizations with very long relationships with El Salvador and broad bases of support throughout the US, throughout Canada. I'm thinking of organizations like SISPES, like Sister Cities, groups that have stood, and Salvade, groups that have stood with El Salvador for decades. I do think that having that at the center has been key to ensuring that the dissemination of information at a grassroots level in North America and in particular, but in other parts of the world, has been quite substantial. I think in addition to that, again, sort of the value of continuing a coalition's work over managing to hold it together for 7 or 8 years or however many years it's been now, which is a long time for this sort of coalition to exist and to maintain the kind of frequency of contact and work, also means that the media that everybody's organization was committed to producing, that all sorts of independent journalists that have come into contact with the struggle in El Salvador. I remember my first encounter with the struggle in El Salvador was back in 2005 when I was working at a community radio station in Southern Ontario. And it was because somebody had been there on an international cooperation agreement, had come back and just wanted to get the word out. So it was everybody just doing what they could in all the spaces they could. And so I think that we created a lot of the media that came out. And then that had different spin-offs. I also think just this, the significance and the real focus of the struggle and but the Mesa maintained over such a long time can also not be discounted in terms of gradually over time accumulating a substantial number of people and attention that then gets the word out in those key moments. And I think in this last year and maybe the last few years, this probably goes a bit to the way the narrative was oriented, real focus on the fight for water and this corporate bullying that was trying to boss El Salvador around. It was a story that people could get into, and because it linked with the local struggle, but also with these kind of core issues that are built into free trade agreements. There was some really good researchers and journalists that dug into that and made that story have legs in a different way than it might have otherwise had. And then just the tremendous victories that El Salvador has had over this last year have provided tremendous material that I mean, we've had support at different points in time from people that have more or less links to journalists in the mainstream or in the independent press that I do think has had its sort of moments in these key events. But I think the root of it is really building on a strong basis, a broad base of support with a broad base of organizations that have these long-term relationships, and just everybody kicking in everything they can, and being ready. Like that thing about having a long-term coalition means that you're ready and you are responding as things and moments come up, both at the local level and at the international level, and capitalizing on those to get the word out and to lift up the voices and the range of demands that that the campaign had.
Great. Thank you, Jen. So just like the last question I wanted to ask was about the role of international solidarity going forward. So I know that there are initiatives underway to connect with anti-mining struggles in other Central American countries. I know you were all aware of the connections to Guatemala and Honduras, and so maybe Pedro, if you wanted to begin, just like how you envision the role of international solidarity in the future of related struggles in the region.
I think Robin made a good point in that the concept that we have of international solidarity is a concept that goes back to the 60s and the 70s, where we had a different world altogether, particularly here in El Salvador. The understanding that we have of international solidarity was the solidarity organizations that were supporting the people that were being victims of the war during the 70s and the 80s, but we have a different world now, and I think like the notion of international solidarity needs to be redefined. But there are a lot of common elements that can be maintained, I think, and one of the way we're looking at it here in El Salvador is that we need to increase a lot more collaboration with our neighbors in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and for the last year or so we have been developing this strategy of working more closely together with organizations that are facing the same issue of mining companies coming into the communities and displacing people, polluting the environment, and generating conflicts and human rights violations. And so one of the things that we're doing is strengthening that relationship and collaboration with different organizations more at the regional level, and stop looking at ourselves as El Salvador and look at ourselves more like as a wider region. And this is because it's all interrelated. In the same way, I think what Manuel is talking about is a really important point in that sometimes it's not an issue of solidarity. Sometimes it's people in the global north making their corporations accountable to human rights standards, right? And it's because it's really not our problem. As and I have this conflict here because I'm Canadian and I'm Salvadorian at the same time. So I have this debate within myself many times in that, like if I'm in Canada, I'd like to make the Canadian corporations accountable to human rights standards, global human rights standards. And as such, I demand that the government of Canada makes those corporations accountable, and the corporations themselves are accountable. And as Salvadorian as well, I being in El Salvador now, I struggle with the same things. It's really not a problem, as Salvadorians and as people in the global south. It's the problem of people in the north. And I think we need to redefine that, right? Because what it requires is like a shifting of understanding and maybe redefining how solidarity works in a much more globalized world that we have now.
Great, thank you, Pedro. Manuel, would you like to come in? I'm sure some of that resonates with you. And also, if you have any final comments or questions for the others, feel free now to make them or ask them. Te escuchamos.
But I just want to say that there's an example of how El Salvador has given us, not only international solidarity has given them. I think there are many, many struggles that are looking, that are being more hopeful now, that when after they've seen what the Salvadorans have achieved. So they've given a lot to the world, and I know of personally, I'm very how you say, hopeful and enthusiastic about continue working with other movements and other struggles on their investor state cases, particularly on mining. And we're working with Mining Watch and CL and other organizations of the allies into trying to project how to expand the work and the experience we've had with El Salvador. So again, this is not this is just to demonstrate how this has been a two-way experience, a two-way of solidarity. But again, we have to redefine the word solidarity.
I guess two main points. One is about this thing that we all have been talking about as the story. And I think it's important to stress that we didn't create the story. Like someone once said to me, oh, those people in the communities in northern El Salvador, they were so clever to package this as pro-water rather than anti-mining. They weren't being clever to package it that way. That was the story. That was the truth. And so this is an incredible story, and there's lots of incredible stories. There's lots of incredible communities doing incredible things around the world. And it's really important to spread the word. So while on one hand, what I'm arguing, one can't simply replicate what La Mesa did that worked, or what international allies did that worked, or how we work together. One can take lessons from it. But one of the key lessons is a lesson of hope, is that this is a tale not only against neoliberalism, but this is a tale of defeating neoliberalism on local, national, and global levels. So this is people around the world who aren't involved in these struggles think that poor people on the ground can't want more than jobs, that they can't possibly care about the environment. What we see is they do. Likewise, people think that a poorer country like El Salvador can't possibly care about the environment. It has to care about earning foreign exchange. The reality is that that's not true. So in some ways, the moral of El Salvador's double wins and in ICSID and its win in passing this law is that the powerful do not always triumph. And I think what's interesting as I reflect back over our years of work together as international allies, we actually never stepped back and said, can we win this? We really never stepped back and said, can La Mesa win this? Can international allies win this? We just kept going. We just kept doing it. And I think that's really, really important for people to understand. And maybe it's whoever a matter of whoever came together in La Mesa and stuck to La Mesa, and whoever came to international allies and stuck in international allies just had some kind of makeup where we weren't willing to actually ask that question. We just kept pursuing, and at some points we had option A, option B, option C. We actually didn't know, we never knew what was the right way. We just pursued different things and said, okay, who wants to do option A? You guys do option A. Who wants to do option B? You guys do option B. We weren't, I think we weren't really critical of, we didn't know the answers, so we just kind of tried everything without, and a very unique grouping without, at least at the core of international allies, without a lot of egos involved, without a lot of grandstanding to get all the credit for one group or two groups. We were very happy to have lots of groups be involved with it, take whatever credit they wanted, but just keep plowing along. So I think we're back to Margaret Mead or something. What's that quote about never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people? That's what we started with in El Salvador. That's what we started with in international allies. And you put the two together and you can do amazing things.
Thank you, Robin. Just some final comments from Jen and Pedro to finish. Maybe Jen first.
Sure. I don't know that I have much more to add. I do think that the value of, an example where people working together and fighting hard over, for many, many years for what they value, for their water, for their land, for what they believe in, fight up against this huge, monstrous model of neoliberal globalization and win. The inspiration that can be taken from that can't be understated. There's a lot of really hard, long fights that are ongoing and have been for a long time, and I think, you know, that we can celebrate with El Salvador and Cabañas and amongst ourselves, and you know what this has shown, that it's not an impenetrable and undefeatable model when you pull together is really important, and we need these to keep going with Salvadorans in the fights that they've got ahead, and with our other partners in different parts of the world that are plowing ahead despite huge odds. So I agree with all that's been said, and I think, you know, I'll take from this coalition work the relationships and all the learnings on the different levels, and as Manuel has referred to, we're trying to take lessons from that into other, you know, other campaigns and conflicts that we're trying to support and accompany, and I think, you know, everything, all the different sorts of relationships and groupings and networks that can come out of this, and you know, and vice versa, this with other struggles is invaluable.
Thank you, Jen. Pedro?
Maybe very quickly, just thank you, Thomas, for the interest and the Democracy Center interest in covering the issue and trying to figure out the learnings and the process of how the whole struggle took place. I think that what you guys are doing is an example of the interest that many other organizations around the world and in El Salvador and in Cabañas and in the communities that were impacted by mining were. You know, everybody wanted to have the interest in learning about mining, the impacts that mining was going to have, and what people have done, and people, and what are the desires that people have in terms of defining their own development. And you know, and we have we're talking about two main formations here, like the National Roundtable Against Mining and the International Allies Against Mining. That both of these formations had a key role to play in the whole anti-mining movement in El Salvador. But this was like, the movement was much more beyond that, right? There were many organizations that contributed in many different ways and many small ways, and there were many, like hundreds of, maybe thousands of people that contributed in small ways. You know, they were signing petitions, they were hosting somebody when they came to the tours in North America and in Europe and in Australia. They were they were organizing small fundraising activities in different parts of the world. There were, you know, like churchgoers that were signing petitions here in El Salvador, and in the end, that's what constituted the movement and brought together all these very important actors, you know, civil society organizations like La Mesa and the Allies. The church came together, you know, political parties came together, government institutions and government officials came together, and everything led to the moment of the prohibition of mining. And as Robin was saying, you know, like, people can take as much credit as they want, which is great, I think, because everybody has something to contribute. But this was the work of, you know, hundreds of thousands of people that contributed to this, and I think that's what the learning that we can, that is, it was a whole movement that led to this victory.
Great, thank you, Pedro. I think that there's so much there, and this has been a really rich conversation, and this is exactly what we wanted to do, was just to provide a platform, an opportunity for you guys to have a conversation kind of at a different level, kind of a more reflective conversation about what can be learned from the struggle. So thank you all for taking the time to participate. Thanks to IPS for their support and co-hosting. And you know, the idea here is that all of this material, the articles and the video conferences, can be shared with people who are getting involved with similar struggles in other places. So it was great to hear Jen and Manuel talking about the ways that they're already thinking about doing that. So we hope to have contributed something to those efforts. So thank you all very much for taking part.
Thanks.
Thank you.